Welcome to Amp Life, the #1 podcast for amputees, hosted by an amputee, and brought to you by Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the Brian Moe, the social media advisor for Torre, and I also happen to be a below-knee amputee. Let's get into today's episode. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to a very special episode of Amp Life. My guests today are the owners of Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics, Ed and Paul De La Torre. Ed and Paul, welcome to Amp Life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This past March, Ed, Drew Buffett, our director of prosthetics, and myself were guests on the Nobody's podcast, which also became episode number 2 of Amp Life podcast. And in the first part of the episode, Ed gave a brief history of how his father came to the United States and started what we now know as Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics. I found the story not only fascinating, but also inspiring. So much so that when we began Amp Life podcast, I knew I wanted to sit down with Ed and Paul for them to tell their story, not only of how their father started this company, but also how De La Torre O&P has evolved over the years, where we are now and where they would like to be moving forward. And before we really get into this discussion today, I want to talk about the company's logo with you just a little bit. I'm always curious about logos companies use to represent themselves. We see in advertising all the time, when we see the Pepsi logo, we don't even need to see the name. We know it's Pepsi or Coke or McDonald's or whatever the case may be. And for anyone listening who hasn't seen the De La Torre logo, head on over to www.delatorreop.com and check it out. When I began to work with the company, I asked Drew to explain to me the significance of the logo, which he did. But for others who don't know, please share the significance of the tower in the De La Torre logo.
So when we developed our logo, it was probably about 25 years ago or so. I worked with a graphic arts company to come up with what I wanted to be, a very specific corporate identity for our company. And the name De La Torre translates from Spanish to English to of the tower.
Okay.
And so as I met with this graphic designer and we discussed the thoughts of it, she suggested that we should build upon that. And what I wanted specifically is, like you just said, Brian, I wanted a logo that was going to transcend time. I mean, the Coke logo, the McDonald's logo, it is very recognizable, and it certainly has not changed over the decades. And I wanted something that would be timeless like that as well. But we built upon the tower meaning of our name. And what I liked about that also was that, in the healthcare world, there are a lot of very obvious logos out there that show the human body, they show a wheelchair, they show crutches, or, something that has a direct connection with something in medicine or in healthcare. And I wanted to be different in that regard. I did not want something that would be so obviously medical. I wanted something a little bit larger or bigger in scope. And so I thought that just building upon the name and having a tower that looks very strong, it looks very solid, like our company is, really, really appealed to me. So that's the backstory of the logo.
Okay, very good. Thanks. So I want to begin our discussion today by asking each of you to describe for our listeners your current roles with De La Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics. Paul, let's start with you.
Well, my title is chairman, but it's not like you're a corporate, chairman per se. I head up the orthotic department, but I'm also fortunate to have a director of orthotics and also a head orthotist. So it's kind of really softened my role, as far as quote unquote leadership or like responsibilities, just because basically we are stronger in orthotics at this time. Prosthetics is coming up to equal that. But, so my role currently, I manage our Butler office, so I'm still seeing patients. Okay. And then on the other days, I'm there Tuesday and Thursday. And then on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm able to see other patients at any of our other locations that are open on those 3 days. Okay. So I'm like a staff orthotist, seeing patients. But obviously, if there are decisions that need to be made, on a corporate level, I'm involved in that, along with Ed, but again, also with the management team. We're very fortunate to have a very strong management team, being responsible for different divisions, like Drew Buffett, you stated, being our director of prosthetics. Gavin Hassel is director of our orthotics department. And we have an office manager, a practice administrator, and a controller. And so, and Ed, manages, all the other business stuff. Whereas I like to say, I do what he doesn't want to do, and he does what I don't want to do. So it works out very well. I mean, it's a good marriage, between the two of us.
Absolutely.
And, it really balances out very well.
Sure. Ed, what about your role in the company?
Sure. So as Paul just described, I am not a clinician, and so I do not see patients. I do not work at all in a clinical realm. My role is more to be the corporate or business head within the company. So when it comes to things like HR issues, payables, accounting, working with our controller, working with our practice administrator over billing, contracting, all of the kind of business stuff behind the business. I also have worked on the building of our offices. We have 8 clinical offices around the city. Besides our laboratory and corporate offices. And so as each of those locations was selected and then built out, I oversaw the construction of the design, the construction, the opening of the office, so to speak. So I take care of all those sorts of details.
Sure. So Ed and Paul, take us back and share the story of your father's journey from Puerto Rico to the United States and how Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics first began.
Well, it's a long and complicated story. I guess we could start by saying that our father was not formally educated as a boy. He did grow up in the depressed era of the 1920s, but on the island of Puerto Rico. So, frankly, the depression that was being experienced here in the U.S. Was even more so being felt in the small, Caribbean island of Puerto Rico. And so he grew up very poor, just to be very honest with you. And he, at the age of 12, hopped on a cruise ship from San Juan to New York City, basically to get away from the poverty of the difficulty of Puerto Rico. And went to New York City to work with his uncle. His uncle owned a grocery store. I believe it was in the Bronx. And he went there basically to start a new life for himself. And I think Dad always saw the U.S. as the land of opportunity, as so many immigrants do.
Right.
And so he came to New York City. At the time the World War II broke out, he lied about his age. I think he was actually 17, not 18.
Right.
And he enlisted with the Marine Corps and did fight in World War II. So after the war was over, came back to New York City, where at this point he had already met our mother, and they had started a relationship. And so now after the war, they were married. And my mother has a sister who was educated. She was the only child in my mother's family that got any type of education.
Okay.
And she became a nurse. And so the sister who my mother has always been very, very close to, that nurse met an orthopedic surgeon in the hospital in which she worked in New York City. And the two fell in love, and they eventually married.
Oh, wow.
So my parents are married, and my mother's sister is married to an orthopedic surgeon. And these two couples decided to share a 2-bedroom apartment in New York, because this is, the mid to late 40s, and they're just establishing their lives now as young married couples. And my uncle, the orthopod, got to know my dad pretty well, of course, living with him.
Right.
And one day he said to our dad, Manny, you're pretty good with your hands. You should consider becoming a brace maker. To which I think my father's reply was something like, well, what's a brace maker? And my uncle, his name was Carl Horn, my Uncle Carl proceeded to explain to him what, at the time they call it a brace maker. Today we prefer to call them orthotists. But in those days, he explained to him what a brace maker was and what they did. And so my father decided to give that a try. And he ended up signing into the school in New York City.
Yeah, our uncle took him to this location in New York, and the term for the school is something you would not use today, because back then the school was called the Institute for Crippled and Disabled.
Oh, wow.
And which later then became the NYU Orthotic and Prosthetic Program.
Okay.
But that's what it was, ICD, Institute of Crippled and Disabled. And he got into the class. I mean, it was a very select few that were accepted. And this is where he was fortunate to take advantage of the GI Bill, and being a vet and so on, got him into the class. And the funny thing about it is, again, his last name is Delatorre, and he's introducing himself to one of the instructors, and he goes, "Hi, my name is Delatorre," and the other fellow says, "No, it's Latorre," and he said, "No, it's Della." They went back for it. It turned out the gentleman's name, the instructor's name, was Dick Latorre. He's Italian, and Dad's last name Delatorre. So when they realized, what was going on, they both laughed, and from that point on, they became best friends.
Oh, very good
And Dick wound up establishing a practice in Schenectady, New York, for many years.
Okay.
But we used to call him Uncle Dick, and there were many times over the years where, if we were shipping out product or receiving product from a supplier, we would get Dick's braces in the mail by accident, and he would get ours. Because the suppliers would get the two names mixed up, and
Right.
so that further, galvanized, the friendship over the years. But and then after that, then I was born in New York, and what brought Dad to Pittsburgh, as far as the history. In 1958, Alcoa had given a grant to build a rehab center, which today is Harmarville.
Okay.
Now it's Health South Harmarville, but back then it was the Harmarville Rehab Center.
Okay.
And that in Pittsburgh, it's up by the U Park, Pitt U Park, up on top of the hill in
Right.
Harmar off 910. Is the old Tudor building that sits up there. That was the original Harmarville Rehab Center.
Okay.
So they put an ad in the journal advertising for as Ed says, a brace maker. And, Dad came, interviewed for the job, and got it. So actually, Dad was the first orthotist at Harmarville Rehab in 1958, and that's what brought us to Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And we used to live in East Liberty, or Sliberty, as they say here in Pittsburgh. And we lived on Black Street off South Negley, and he worked there for 2 years.
Okay.
And in the meantime, because we had moved to Pittsburgh, my uncle, Carl, and his wife, our aunt, if I'm not mistaken, he went to Puerto Rico to meet his mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And he fell in love with the island. So since we weren't in New York anymore, Uncle Carl moved his practice to San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Oh, wow.
And after a year or so, he, in communication, the two sisters, back then you wrote letters.
Right.
And, Uncle Carl said, Manny, come back to your roots. We could use a good brace maker down here. Plus, my wife is driving me crazy because she misses her sister, kind of a thing. And also, Dad.
Yeah, I was going to say at the same time here at Harmarville, our father, was a real, I guess you would call type A personality.
Okay.
Very strong-willed, very independent.
Well, he's a Marine.
Yeah.
So that says.
He came to find that working within the institution of the hospital was very, very frustrating because when you work within a large organization like that, as I used to hear him tell me stories, if he wanted to buy a hammer because he needed a hammer in his workshop, he wanted to just go to Sears, buy the hammer, give someone a receipt for it, and get reimbursed. But he wasn't able to do that. He had to put in a purchase requisition, had to wait for it to be approved. It could take days, if not a week,
wow.
before it would be okayed for him to buy a hammer. And that sort of thing drove him crazy.
Especially when we lived 3 blocks from a Sears.
Yeah. And so when our uncle made the request, hey, why don't you move down here to Puerto Rico, establish a private practice? I think you could do really well down here. I think my dad thought, yeah, that sounds good to me and gets me out of, working in this, corporate ladder that he was a part of at Harmarville. And so they packed up shop, they being my mother, father, and Paul, packed up and moved to Puerto Rico. And Dad did start a practice in San Juan. I guess a couple years later, I was born. So I was born in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
And I guess approximately a year after that, so this would put us in 1962, the doctors here in Pittsburgh that worked with our father at Harmarville missed him. And there were a group of doctors that got together, I guess, basically, and were chatting about how much they miss Manny and what a great brace maker he was, and that they wished they had him back. And so those doctors eventually reached out to our father in Puerto Rico and basically said, hey, Manny, we'd love it if you would come back to Pittsburgh.
Well, the other thing, too, what added to that was back in those days when orthopedic surgeons were doing their residency, they had to do a 6-month rotation in rehab medicine.
Okay.
So that's where they met our father, was at Harmarville, because they were part of the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, students at the Pitt Medical School, but they were spending 6 months at Harmarville just dealing with stroke victims, traumas, whatever, just the patients that wound up at Harmarville.
Sure.
So orthopods back then had a very varied, exposure to different healthcare situations that they might be facing in private practice.
Okay.
So that's where he met these gentlemen, and he reached out to them, and they were kind of reaching out to each other at the same time.
Okay.
And at the time, he had stated to them, he said, "I just had another son, so I've got 2 children now. Will you support me if I do come back?" And they were all like, "Yeah." There were about a half a dozen or so of them that responded yes, and so that was the catalyst to bring us back to Pittsburgh, because as a lot of folks say when they find out that we're from Puerto Rico, they're like, "What are you doing in Pittsburgh? Shouldn't you be in Miami, New York, LA, Chicago?" And basically it was, the work. His career is what brought us to Pittsburgh and kept us here.
And there was another element to it, too, that I think was really important to Mom and Dad. And that was the point of our education. You have to keep in mind that I know we haven't really talked about my mother much at all, but my mother was very similar to my father in that she too was uneducated.
Okay.
She grew up in a very poor family as well, in a different part of the island of Puerto Rico. And her father actually passed away 3 months before my mother was born.
Oh, wow.
So she was in the womb, literally, when her father died, and her mother, in a very poor part of the island, had a difficult time raising children, as you can well imagine.
Right,
Again, this is the mid-20s, the Depression is settling in, and so it's a very difficult time. And my mother was shipped to New York City to live with her grandmother. I believe she was about 8 years old or so. And that's what got her there, simply because her mother was not able to raise her and provide for her in Puerto Rico. So that's how my mother got to New York. And so she was not well educated herself. And she dropped out of school, I think in high school, basically when the war had broken out, to work sewing, making uniforms and things like that for the military. So you have 2 people that are working very hard, living in the land of opportunity, but neither one of them was really well formally educated. And now they've got 2 sons, and they're living in the island of Puerto Rico, and they think, well, they want to provide for us what they, of course, didn't have for themselves.
Right.
And that's a good education. And unfortunately, even in the 60s, the public school system of Puerto Rico wasn't all that great. And Paul, by this point, you were in the 2nd grade, right?
Second grade.
So he had gone through kindergarten and 1st and 2nd grades in Puerto Rico, and I'm just a baby. I'm a newborn baby. But they thought to themselves, moving back to Pittsburgh, our children will have better educational opportunities there than they're going to have if we remain here. So besides the professional aspect of it all, and these doctors calling my dad back to Pittsburgh, Mom and Dad also, I think, made the decision to make the move because they were going to provide for their sons, a much better future.
Sure.
And so that was very important to them too.
Okay. So in the late 1970s, I was first exposed to my grandfather's business. He owned the local market and butcher shop. My friends always thought that it was cool, but the reality was that everything we did was all about building the business. Even as a child, they would give me something to do, and they would find something that I was capable of doing. And so it wasn't, my friends thought, oh, you get to go to the store and hang out at the butcher shop and have fun. There was no fun. It was work. And so I wanted to ask, what was it like growing up as your father was building this business?
like the son of a butcher.
Yeah, exactly the same. It was no fun. It was all work.
Well, first off, when we lived in Puerto Rico, we lived literally in the back of the office. I mean, it was a storefront. It was like a retail storefront where he had the waiting area and the exam rooms, and then there was a small lab in the back, where he, built the braces, he had his grinding, his equipment and that. And behind that, you went through a door that went into our living room.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In the kitchen and the 2 bedrooms that, were 3 bedrooms that were, back there. And, people ask me, say, how long have you been doing this? I'm 63. And I show them the scar on my left index finger where I almost cut the tip off when I was 6, cutting stock for my father, because he used to save the scrap leather, because he would put wedges between the sole of the shoe to kind of tilt a child's foot a certain way, whatever. So he always saved scraps. And what he wanted me to do was just cut the little ends off, so he would have like a rectangular piece of leather, and that would go in a little shoebox to be used for wedges.
Okay.
And I'm cutting these things, and one time he called my name. I turned my head to say what. In the meantime, I kept cranking my hand, and bingo, my finger got into the cutter. And again, it went about halfway through.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, I was 6 years old, working in the back with Dad. As they say, the rest is history.
Right.
But
And we had the same sort of scenario, frankly, when we moved to Pittsburgh. My dad built his shop. So again, it's 1962. We moved into a small house in the northern suburbs here of Pittsburgh, and he built the shop, as we called it then. The business was always called the shop.
Sure.
In the basement of the house in which we lived.
Oh, wow.
And so I always remember when people ask me about my childhood or, early memories or things like that. To me, I always remember living upstairs and going down into the basement where our shop was built out. And so my early childhood memories are of, working with my dad, holding braces as he riveted these metal braces together, or grinding pieces, as Paul said, with different types of grinding machines and things that we had. I remember getting our front door of the house, the doorbell ringing, and the UPS man, bringing us boxes of parts and componentry and inventory that we had purchased for the company.
The Walker
boxes. Yeah,
were
Walkers. Huge boxes. When you're a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid and they deliver this great big box, at your front door, several of them, I had to bring them into the house and carry them downstairs into the basement. And I remember my dad teaching me as a kid, to open the box and look at the packing slip and, how to read the packing slip and see, if there's 4 walkers, to count to make sure there are 4 walkers in the box or, that sort of thing. And I remember doing that all the time. And, those are things that at that era, adults did when they went to work, so to speak. And, here I am, a kid, doing the exact same thing in the living room of our house. And so on the 10th of the month, Dad always paid bills 1 day a month. He told all his vendors, I'll pay your bill on the 10th. And our dining room table got cleaned off, and he and my mother would sit. Out came the checkbook, out came an adding machine, not a calculator, but an adding machine. And all the stacks and stacks of invoices. And it seemed like all evening long they would pour over all the different invoices, and my mother would be writing checks, to pay all the bills and stuff all the envelopes. And, that happened for years. The 10th of the month is always when that got done. So
the machine shop, or the grinding room as we called it, used to be in the garage.
Okay.
I mean that's what he converted.
We had a one-car garage.
Yeah, we had a one-car
house.
garage.
Yeah, in our house.
So, and back then, Dad used to drive a Volkswagen Beetle.
Okay,
and those are air-cooled cars.
Right.
So in the wintertime especially, and this is something that I will never forget, he would lift up the back of the car, because the motor is in the back of the Beetle, and he had a 4-watt light bulb attached to an extension cord, and he had a blanket. He put that light bulb under between the engine and the blanket, and he literally, like tucking a baby to bed.
Oh, wow.
He wrapped the blanket around the engine and then just closed, didn't latch it all the way, but just closed the rear and plugged it in, and that light bulb kept the water, the antifreeze, from freezing because the next morning.
In the wintertime.
In the wintertime, because the next morning, because back then, Dad used to do a lot of house calls.
Okay.
He would go to patients. I know going to the hospitals, to visit patients. So, he needed his car to be able to start in the morning.
Right.
And then seeing patients, he would see patients in the house. And we had a freezer, chest freezer in the laundry room.
Okay.
We put a mat on it and then a bed sheet over top, and he would put kids up there, or he would have you sit up there.
Yeah, that was our exam table.
That was his exam table.
Was the top of a chest freezer.
Wow.
Yeah. So they'd be in there next to the furnace and the laundry tub and the washer and the dryer.
Oh my goodness.
But people got used to it. Nobody ever complained.
Right.
It was just
the 60s. There was a very different mentality about delivering health care than we have today.
Oh, absolutely.
It was a completely different world than we have today. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but we'd bring them through the garage. If somebody was like in a wheelchair, we'd open the garage door, bring them into the garage, and then there were 2 steps from the garage up into the floor.
Okay.
In the basement there. Bring them backwards up on the steps. Then help them get up, and then put them up on the freezer.
Up on top of the freezer.
Up on top of the freezer to measure their leg. Usually it's for leg brace. To take whatever measurements, or if it was a back brace, just have them stand, because we close the door, have them stand there, disrobe, take the measurements, and they pull their pants back up and shirt down, and okay, that's it.
Wow.
We'll call you when the brace is ready. Or if it was a corset, something we had on the shelf. Okay, hold 1 second. Let me go see if we have a size 40 for you, and if they needed some other pieces added. We'd schedule he'd schedule an appointment, come back tomorrow or next day, or day after, or whatever.
I just wanted to add one last thing, since you asked about working as kids.
Sure.
The truth is that we always worked within the company, whether it was in the evening, every Saturday, every summer. When we were off school, we ended up we were working within the business. We didn't have the option to not work. I remember when I was in high school, a lot of my friends got jobs at the local McDonald's or the local Dairy Queen or something, the typical teenager job, that the kids would get at those times. And I wanted to have a job like that too. I thought it would be fun to work in a McDonald's, because, all my friends were there. And so it would be fun to do something like that. And I basically wasn't allowed, because Dad fully expected that we were going to be working within the shop in our off time. And so we played sports as kids, and we played ice hockey. Oddly enough, 2 Puerto Rican boys that played ice hockey in Pittsburgh. But I would have a hockey game at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning. And when the game was over, my mother would take me home. I'd take a shower, and then she'd drive me to the shop. At this point, our business had moved out of the house.
Okay.
And then she would drive me to the shop, where I would work until 3 in the afternoon with my dad. So, we got to do our sports thing, as a kid. But then we also had to work.
Wow.
So
definitely not the way it is today.
Definitely not.
No. Yeah, people always ask how I got into this, and I tell them kicking and screaming.
Well, it's a great lead-in for where I want to go next, because I want to talk to you a little bit about how each of you got involved in the business. And so, Paul, when did you decide that you wanted to be a CPO?
Well, it goes back to my college years. When I went to the University of Dayton, and I started out in pre-med.
Okay.
Actually, I was looking to get into dentistry.
Okay.
And kind of, tongue-in-cheek, the reason I wanted to do that was because our dentist at the time, just like our business started, he had his office in the basement of his home.
Okay.
Okay. And he worked 4 days a week. Fridays was his golf day. And I thought, that's pretty cool. And he has a nice used Porsche in the garage, and, lived a very nice lifestyle, belonged to a country club. And I'm like, I want to be like Ralph. So went to college, started out in pre-med, and biochemistry did me in.
Okay.
That's when I realized that, this just wasn't going to work out for me. And honestly, that's the summer that I ran away from home.
Oh, wow.
And I went to the Jersey Shore for the summer.
Okay.
Which Dad wasn't very happy about that, but my mom was like, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of him. Just go have fun."
Right.
And it was that time that I realized that, you know what, I'm good at this, because by then, you know, I'm a sophomore in college, you know, and like Ed said, you know, we've been doing this all our lives. And honestly, over the years, I had developed the hand skills that Dad had, you know, just working alongside of him, because, you know, by then he was giving me things to do to finish. And I mean, I was making braces start to finish,
Right.
you know, including the sewing, you know, and everything that was involved in making a leg brace, sewing the leather, you know, and, you know, a whole bunch of other things. And so I thought, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. And when I went back to school that fall, I thought, well, I'm going to get a degree in business. Figure, you know, help run the business and that. So I talked to my counselor, guidance counselor, and mind you, I'm going into my junior year. And he said, you know, if you do this, he goes, you'll be a second semester freshman, credit-wise, because you have all these science credits.
Oh, wow.
And for business, he said, the only ones that'll transfer are the first semester, because back then everybody had to take English. They had to take those classes, you know, starting out, that everybody had to take those classes. So I said, no. I said, I want to graduate with my class in 76. What do I have to do? He said, get a degree in general studies. He said, you can take any 300, 400 level classes, you graduate, you get the credits, you graduate. So that's when I thought, okay, fine. So that's when I started taking kinesiology, anatomy classes, physiology, you know, and a variety of different classes that I figured would benefit me later, you know, knowing that I would want to go to Northwestern for my education.
Sure.
And so I did that, and that's kind of what led into it, you know, segue into, you know, getting into the profession. And then I did get accepted in Northwestern in spring of 77.
Okay.
And I did I did that, then I did a 4-year residency in Kansas City.
Okay.
You know, and then came back in 1981. But I mean, it was that running away from home that summer that I realized that, you know, it was almost like I missed it, which I was kind of shocked that I missed it, because I was having a blast at the beach, you know, with all my frat, you know, all my frat brothers, and but that was the turning point in my life, was that summer.
Okay. So Ed, I know that you have both an undergraduate and graduate degree in architecture. How did you transition from that career path to running the company today?
It's a crazy story, but a good story. So you're right. I was kind of the oddly enough, I felt like I was the black sheep of the family.
Okay.
I'm the younger son, obviously, and I wanted, having worked in the company all my life for 18 years, when it came to going away to college, I felt like I wanted nothing to do with the business. I'd had enough of orthotics at that point, and so I did pursue a degree in architecture. I'm more of a creative type, more of a big picture type of person, and so architecture was perfect for me. And I ended up going to Virginia Tech, which is a school about 6 hours away from here, and did proceed to complete my bachelor's and then ultimately a master's degree there. And oddly enough, when I left college and moved to Pittsburgh in 1985, I did not pursue a career in architecture, even though I had 2 degrees in it, because at the time, in 1985, you know, the economy of the U.S. was going through a very difficult time. Interest rates were sky high. Businesses were not building buildings, and architects were really struggling. And I met my wife while in college, and we married while still in college.
Okay.
She too got a bachelor's and a master's at Virginia Tech. And so, you know, when I was entering the workforce, I was already married, and I couldn't do what I saw so many other architects doing, and that's, you know, moving to New York City and, you know, 6 guys living together in a 3-bedroom apartment.
Oh, wow.
Because they were working for architecture firms and making pennies on the dollar, and so the only way they could survive was to, you know, live in these types of arrangements.
Sure.
Because, yeah, again, architecture was going through a very, very difficult time. The American economy was going through a tough time. So I didn't have that luxury with a wife, obviously, and so I decided to not pursue a job in architecture, and I ended up working for a fashion company. I got involved in the retail and ultimately wholesale worlds of fashion retail. And I worked for the Ralph Lauren Polo Ralph Lauren company.
Wow. Okay.
And I was there for 5 years, and frankly, I loved it. I was successful at it, and had grown through that company, and was I thought I would be there, for the rest of my career.
Sure.
But again, it was 1990, and our business was at a bit of a crossroads. Dad was, I guess, about 65 years old at the time, and he was pretty burned out. Paul had been in the company for years, and Paul was trying to do a variety of things within the company, and Dad, being a stubborn burned out owner, was making it very difficult to do a variety of things, to grow, to expand, to try different things.
Sure.
Typical, very, very typical patriarchal, leader.
Right.
And I was in a discussion. Actually, my mother had come over to my house and was visiting with my wife and I at the time, and we had 2 small children at that point. And my mother was lamenting over some of the things that were going on within the family business and how Dad really needed to get out of it. And I just felt that God spoke to me at that moment and told me that now was the time for me to join into the family business.
Okay.
And I was shocked, quite frankly. It wasn't anything that I was looking for.
Sure.
I was happy in my career. I was happy with, kind of doing my own thing. But, when God speaks to you, you need to listen. And that's what I decided to do, was that I would leave Ralph Lauren and I would join the family business, but as I've already described, not as a clinician, because I had already done college. I did 6 years of college, and nothing was medical in that education. Absolutely nothing was medical. And so there was discussion at that point that maybe I should go back to school, or I should go to Northwestern and pursue a degree in orthotics and or prosthetics. And I just said no. I wasn't willing. I have 2 children now, and I'm beyond college.
Sure.
I'm not ready to go back and start all over again. And but what I did gain in 5 years with Ralph Lauren was a lot of good business experience and corporate experience.
Okay.
And so I said, why don't I come in and help develop the business side of our business, while Paul can continue with all the clinical work and networking with the doctors and seeing the patients and taking care of the making of the braces and eventually the prosthetics, of course, that came into our practice. And I'll focus on building the company and taking care of the contracting, as I've already described. And then, at that time when I came into the business, we only had 1 location. So if we were going to build this company, we're going to have to open up more offices. And so my architecture degree came in with, designing those offices and, finding the locations, designing them, having them built, working with contractors and so on. And so, there was definitely a role for me to have within building the company, and one that was not clinical.
Sure.
So that's how I came in.
And, when I asked you about doing this podcast, I shared with you my bigger idea to eventually bring Gavin in and sit down and talk about the orthotic side of things. But one of the misconceptions about orthotics that I find out in the world, if I mention the word orthotics, a lot of people immediately say something to do with shoes.
Right. And
so for someone who doesn't know, how would you describe what orthotics is? I mean, yes, you do custom shoes, but there's so much more than that.
Sure. Or Paul, why don't you should jump in with that? Sure.
I looked in the dictionary and typed in orthotics, and it does mention, shoes, inserts, but it also it's a branch of medicine dealing with fitting. It says of orthotic devices, but I mean orthotics or ortho, it means to straighten.
Right.
In Latin, and our director of the orthotic program at Northwestern, Jim Russ, used to always say that it was a misnomer, because actually we would call an orthotic a foot orthosis.
Okay.
Because any brace, quote unquote brace, we got in trouble if we used the word brace. We weren't. That was forbidden to use. It's an orthosis.
Okay.
It's a spinal orthosis. It's a lower extremity orthosis, or whatever. So I mean, what we call a foot orthotic is actually a foot orthosis.
Okay.
So it's just one of those words that. It's like saying, carbon copy. Make a copy. Do a.
you're showing your age by talking
I know,
about a carbon copy.
I know, right. But what's the company? I can't think of the company that made the copy machines.
IBM or
Xerox.
Xerox. Go get a Xerox of this for me.
Sure.
You know, what do you mean by Xerox? What's Xerox's machine? It's a copy machine. That meant, make a copy, when you Xerox something. So that's basically what a foot orthotic is. It's just, it's a Xerox.
Right.
So it's a misnomer, but it's been used so broadly, and especially in the world of podiatry, that podiatrists call them orthotics.
Yeah,
so it's just become
I was going to say
the norm.
I was going to say Dr. Scholes, I think, is responsible to some degree for it from the aspect of you see television commercials that talk about, a Dr. Scholes foot orthotic.
Right.
And so, when you have advertisements that span, television and they introduce a word perhaps to our everyday vocabulary, people think, oh, an orthotic is that thing that Dr. Scholes makes and it goes in your shoe. And, no, technically speaking, any type of brace, any type of supportive device, orthosis, as Paul said, so a neck orthosis, a thumb orthosis, all of these are devices that support, straighten, help, immobilize something so that healing can take place within the body.
And that's very interesting to me because, I have used, now that I know that it would be, a lower extremity orthosis, but like a crow walker.
Yes.
But so when I was using that, and I call it a crow walker because that's what the doctor said, but other people would be like, oh, you have a brace. And I'd be like, well, I don't think that's what it is, but okay, for their understanding. So it's very interesting to know.
Well, when we were kids, everything that our father made was a brace.
Sure.
And it's been in through I would say the 80s and the 90s that the vernacular has changed.
Well,
and
Jim
profession,
Ross.
the profession was really trying to elevate itself into becoming more clinical and more respected as a clinical science. And when you talk about making a back brace, it's not as respectful a term or whatever as calling it an orthosis, which is more truly the clinical terminology for that device. So that's when we started seeing the shift. Our dad always described himself as a brace maker, and Paul, I think, always described himself as an orthotist. Okay. And it's just, from the era in which they were trained and they worked.
Well, Jim Russ, again, the former director, he's passed on. He was a pioneer in our profession, and he was the one that really pushed the terminology of orthosis, prosthesis and orthosis. And because back then, actually, when I was a student at Northwestern in 77, the name of Dad's company was Torre Orthopedic Appliances.
Oh, wow, okay.
Mm-hmm. And he would come up to me, and he used to kind of mumble, kind of mimic. Was your father selling refrigerators and freezers and stoves? What do you mean appliances?
Oh, wow.
It's Torre Orthotics. So I called Dad, and I said, Dad, you need to change the name of the business. What do you mean? I said, well, Jim Russ. And he was like, well, blankety blank Jim Russ. I said, no, seriously, Dad, you need to change it to Torre Orthotics. To me, it sounds more professional than appliances.
Right.
And I told him, so are you selling freezers, refrigerators? What are you selling? Okay. and he changed the name.
And technically, we did change the name.
He changed the name at that time. So it was like 77, 78 when we changed it to Torre Orthotics.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about how the company has evolved over all these many years. I know that Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics has been in business now for 55 years. Ed, how does that compare with the amount of time the average business lasts?
Well, I think in our profession, there aren't a lot of companies that are still independent like we are, and are 55 years old. I certainly remember as a child, my father and mother would take us to the national conventions that were held every year. There's two national organizations that are preeminent within our industry, the American Orthotic and Prosthetic Association, or what's called AOPA, and the other one's the American Academy of Orthotists and Prosthetists, AAOP. And they each have their annual conventions, and they did when we were kids. These organizations have been around a long time, and I would go to these conventions with Mom and Dad. And I met, many peers of my father from, with businesses all over the country. Today, the vast majority of those companies no longer exist. Either they didn't have a second generation to come into the business like Paul and I did,
Sure.
or they just at some point along the line sold the business to somebody that was, in the process of acquiring.
Sure.
And so I think there really are very few businesses like ours that have lasted 50 plus years within our industry, and remain independent. The interesting thing, I ask people all the time when I interview clinicians, orthotists or prosthetists, and they want to join our business, I always ask them, how did you get involved in this field? I'm always intrigued because it is such a small and very unique, niche within the healthcare world. I'm always curious to find out how that happened. And up until about 10 years ago, the answer almost always was, well, I got involved because I had, like you mentioned, I had a relative that, was an amputee, or, my father was an amputee, or, my mother was in an accident and had to wear a brace, or I had scoliosis. And literally we've had people that, Ed, your father made me a Milwaukee brace to treat my scoliosis. And, and so I'm wearing that brace as a young teenager, and I wanted to get involved in the field. And so most people, the vast majority of people, came into the field because they touched it in some fashion early in their life.
Okay.
Today, that's not so much the case. It is in some regards, but today, young people are learning about it in college and finding out that it is a part of the rehab sciences, and and they're actually pursuing it because they're interested in biomedical engineering or something along those lines.
Sure.
But again, that up until about 10 years ago, that wasn't so much the case. So I think that also contributes to how businesses are transforming and where the longevity is. It's not really just being passed down to next generations like it did, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Today, it's taken on a different life.
Okay. So you were an orthotic company, and you mentioned about businesses that maybe do evolve or do change a little bit to keep going. At what point did it become Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics?
That was back after I had come home and established myself with Dad. In the early '80s is when Life Flight came into existence at Allegheny General and Presby and Mercy. I mean, Pittsburgh is unique.
Yeah, they're the three
level one trauma centers, and that's the unique thing about Pittsburgh is, Pittsburgh is not that large of a city, but yet we have 3 level 1 trauma centers.
Right.
And back then, the fact that these helicopters were bringing accident victims from 100 miles away. I mean, there accidents were happening up in Erie, Central Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and they wound up in one of the 3 hospitals in Pittsburgh.
Sure.
The demand for trauma was increasing, and we were getting very busy with trauma braces, molded back braces, TLSOs, cervical injuries, halos, and such. And so our practice was really growing at that time. In the meantime, I had just started doing the prosthetics, so we changed the name from Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics. It was like 1980... maybe 1983, 84, that we changed the name. And this is when Drew Buffett, our prosthetic director, we were introduced to him through a meeting through Gavin Hassel, our orthotic director, met him at a conference down in Miami. He came back because, he knew that I needed help with prosthetics because I was still so busy with the orthotics that was just, booming.
Right. And
so that's when I, had a number of late night conversations with Drew, trying to get him to move from Virginia to Pittsburgh. And it's going on 24 years that Drew has been with us, and it's been a real blessing, for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. So, so you brought Drew on, and so since Drew has been here, how have you seen the prosthetic side grow over these past 24 years?
Well, it's been a slow but steady growth. And I say that I often use the example of as our company was growing, and we went through a season of tremendous growth in the early to mid-'90s. We won a HMO contract here in Pittsburgh, actually the very first HMO contract ever introduced into our city.
Oh, wow.
It was offered through, at the time, what was called Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western Pennsylvania.
Right.
Today we know that insurance company is Highmark.
Right.
But it was before that name even was created. They created an HMO called Keystone Health Plan West.
Right. Yeah.
And this was a newfangled thing to the healthcare world. The idea of being specifically contracted to treat patients at a certain fee schedule. Everything was being controlled now by the insurance company. They could say yes, they could say no to doctors, to providers, to patients, and it was a radically different sort of time in healthcare. And they offered a contract, an exclusive contract. Only one company was going to be the provider within this HMO world. And long story short, we were very fortunate to win that contract here in Pittsburgh. So overnight, we now had literally all the patients in the city of Pittsburgh that would need an orthosis or a prosthesis that has this insurance, which at the time was the majority of people in Pittsburgh.
Right.
They all had to go to Delatory to get their device.
Sure.
And so business just exploded for us in a very short period of time, and we started growing. I mean, there was a season there where I think we were hiring 2 employees a month every month.
Wow.
And still it seemed like it wasn't enough. So to give you a little bit of perspective, when I joined the company in 1990, my father had 7 employees. Outside of Paul,
Right.
we had 7 employees in the company. And from, I would say, probably around 1995, so 5 years after I came into the company, we were up to about 50 employees.
Wow.
And today we have 80. And so again, but we just went through a season of tremendous growth.
Right.
And orthotics and prosthetics were both growing together as a result of this contract. But again, the example that I say is I always liken it to a snowball rolling down a hill. We all know the snowball starts very small and it gets
Right.
bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, the prosthetic snowball started rolling and was getting bigger with each day that went by, but the orthotic snowball had a 25-year head start. And so even though prosthetics was growing, orthotics was growing too.
Right.
And growing almost at a faster rate back at that time because it was that much bigger to begin with.
Right.
Today, now 2017, it's very different. Our prosthetics department, frankly, is going through, right now we're going through a season of wonderful growth. And we're making real inroads within the prosthetic marketplace. But in the orthotic marketplace, it's a very, very, very mature market. There isn't a whole lot of extra business to be found in Pittsburgh. We do have companies that are competitors, so we're certainly not the only one in town
Right.
doing what we do. But again, through all the many changes that have happened in healthcare over the last 10, 12 years or so, Pittsburgh is fluctuating as well through all those changes. And I would just say orthotics is much more mature, so we don't have the growth that we had in the 90s to obtain business.
Sure. And so you mentioned having competitors elsewhere here in the city of Pittsburgh. And with the way insurance has changed over the years, people have more options of where they can go. And so I want to put you guys on the spot a little bit and ask you, why do you believe someone should choose De La Torre over another company?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we've worked really, really hard to be the company where we have to make 3 people happy at the same time every day. Mm-hmm. We have to make the patient happy.
Right.
They always are first, of course.
Right.
They're the reason why we're in business. And so whatever that patient's need is, we need to do everything we can to satisfy that need.
Right.
At the same time, we have to make the referring physician or physical therapist or whoever it is that pointed that patient to our company, we have to keep them happy.
Right.
Obviously, we have a lot of physicians in this city that do refer their patients to us, and they have a very high expectation.
Right,
Over
absolutely.
these 55 years, they've come to expect that their patients are going to be taken care of in a very certain way, within a certain period of time, with a device that's going to be excellent. And so we have to maintain that so that the physician continues
Right.
to point their patients towards us. And then at the third leg of that stool is the insurance company.
Sure.
Because ultimately they do have a say as well in how all of that happens. Yes, they're the ones that ultimately are going to pay the bill, but at the same time, since they have a say in how the patient is to be treated as well, they also have to be kept happy. So as we work with these three different types of individuals, the patient, a clinically trained professional, or someone in billing, someone within the insurance company, we have to be three different kinds of people all at the same time.
Right.
And we need to keep each of those types of people very happy and very pleased with what we're doing. And I think that the staff that we have on board is the very best of the city in doing that. We really look for people that are truly caring types of people.
Absolutely.
Because you have to show care to the billing staff at the insurance company.
Right.
You have to show them that, you're a team player with them. And you
Absolutely.
want them to be a team player with us. And you want to be caring. Of course, being caring to the patient goes without saying.
Right.
You just have to. We're in healthcare. That's what we
Right.
have to do. And with the physicians, we want to show them that we are clinically intelligent, that we have the very best ideas and protocols and products and so on in order to take care of that patient's needs as quickly as possible. Many times we're introducing to the physicians, hey, let me show you, there's this new device out there that we
Right.
think is really super, and you may not be aware of it, so allow us to tell you about it. And we want the physicians and the physical therapists to see us as a resource for information,
Right.
not just someone they pass the patient on to. And so I think we pursue all of these things very seriously, very diligently, and that's what they ultimately see and why they like working with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well said. Some of our listeners know, some of our listeners don't know, but as an amputee, I come to De La Torre as a patient, and so now we have this relationship that's more than just me being a patient here, which is great. But one of the things that kept me here, I didn't know it at the very beginning, was how the caring and not being treated like a number. I can tell you that no one has ever treated me like I'm a number. And when I have an idea about, specifically for my prosthesis, no one's sitting there saying, you have no idea what you're talking about, or that's stupid, or, whatever. I specifically see Drew the most, and he's like, yeah, we'll try that. So I feel like we're really a team,
Right.
Working together to provide the best outcome.
That's great.
And that's what keeps, I've been other places, been treated like I'm just a number in a business, and I personally don't enjoy that, and I'm sure others don't as well.
Well, the other thing, too, I think over the years, we've basically created, since it's a family business, we've basically created a culture
Right.
that is just very, very obvious, here within the company. And, I think that it's a culture of, creativity. We always said, well, this is the De La Torre way. Well, what's the De La Torre way? Well, you do this, this, and this in making this device. However, we've always, encouraged our staff. Now, if you have a new idea that will improve on that
Right.
to make it easier, more efficient, cost effective, tell us. We're open to, suggestions, and that becomes the new De La Torre way.
Right.
And as a result of that culture, I think it's a testimony that people stay here for a long time.
Yes.
I'm 63 years old now, and I never thought I would see the day where I would be attending retirees parties. And, we just retired 4 employees in the last year,
Yeah.
that were with us for over 25 years.
Over 30?
Over 30 years, excuse me.
Right.
And we have staff now. Drew's been here 24 years.
Right.
Gavin Hassel, our director of orthotics, 25. And Dan Wilson, head orthotist, same thing. And there are technicians in the back that went to local school here called the Median School, which was a school to train technicians.
Okay.
Median exists no more.
Right.
And
I've never heard of it, so yeah. no.
And
Yeah.
they're still working with us. They've all
yeah,
been
they're
here
still working with us. They're back
over
there.
20 years.
That's incredible. That's really a testament to what goes on here
Yeah.
Into the relationship. And really, I tell people this all the time, outside of the podcast, I said, it just feels like a family. It just seems like, everyone just, everyone communicates and talks and, hey, how's it going kind of thing. And so I think that goes a long way with people to keep them, longevity wise.
That's great.
I want to throw in something. This wasn't in my question, but something Paul just said. We recently got some new equipment on the prosthetic side, and I wanted to ask you about how that's worked out. If you could maybe elaborate a little bit about what the equipment is. I'm not going to try to say what it's called because I'll get it wrong. But how that's been working out and how that's helped the business.
Sure. Well, we purchased our first CAD/CAM system in the orthotic and prosthetic world. Some company 25 years ago developed a CAD/CAM and carver type of system to help in the manufacturing processes. I think it was originally designed for prosthetics in particular.
Yes.
Today it's used in both prosthetics and orthotics, but this is, of course, using a computer to digitally make adjustments to the shape of a device that you're going to manufacture, and then there's a machine that carves out the mold by which you're going to manufacture the device on top of it. Right. We've been looking at CAD/CAM systems and carvers for over 20 years. Since they first came out, they were very sexy to look at our national conventions, where, of course, they were prominently displayed. And they're very, very expensive, well into six figures into buying this technology. And so, we looked at it and seriously considered it. And for many years, I thought in particular that the technology was very, very expensive for what it was doing. I wasn't convinced that the technology was developed enough to give us the return on investment that we would ultimately want to have for laying out six figures. And so over the years in particular, we've really kept an eye on, and Drew Buffett in particular, from the prosthetic side, he had a strong interest in it, and we talked often over the years about when was the right time to do this, to pull the trigger and buy one of these machines. Well, we finally did that earlier this year. I believe it was actually in January that we received our new CAD/CAM system, and it is working incredibly well. I love the fact that our technical staff, who is actually using it, doing the programming, they've just embraced it in such a wonderful way. They love the technology. All of the prosthetists now have been trained on the software as well, on how to make the adjustments that they need to do in order to carve out the mold by which the prosthesis socket will be manufactured on top of. And we're just seeing tremendous results. And so the investment was still a large one. The price hasn't really changed a whole lot over the last 25 years, but what it produces has definitely increased, and the quality has become far greater. And today we're thrilled that we made the investment. I think we did it at just the right time. Sure. And right time for us as a company, I think a right time within the industry. And it's working very well.
And it's really fascinating to watch. And for anyone who's interested, we have all the videos on our social media at De La Torre PRS. So that's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can check out those videos and see how all this equipment works. For me, it's fascinating, and I know it is for some other people as well. I want to ask you guys one last question before we wrap up here today. We have discussed how the business got started, how it's grown over the years. How do you see the business currently today?
I think currently we're in a tremendous place. I think we're very solid in the Pittsburgh marketplace. As I said, we have competitors, and so every day they push us to be better, to be changing. We've come through a lot of challenges in the last few years. One of the great challenges I'd like to say we've pretty much conquered is bringing in an electronic healthcare record. We changed our billing and record keeping systems rather dramatically about 2 years ago. Okay. Because this is what's required in today's marketplace. Sure. If you're going to be in healthcare, you need to be able to communicate electronically with a variety of different people, insurance companies, Medicare. There's a wide variety of organizations and professionals that you need to be able to communicate with, and so we made the change to a very, very advanced electronic healthcare record, or EHR, and that was a major change for us internally, because it is a lot more work, quite frankly. Sure. There's a lot more detail that needs to go into the patient record. And so there's more that's required of us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting more revenue as a result of it. So from a business standpoint, there's more energy and more effort that goes into the maintaining of this healthcare record, but there's not necessarily a greater return on the dollar for it. So it's required us to make a wide variety of changes within the company, and I think we've come through that very, very well. And the healthcare professionals that we associate with, of course, I think are seeing the positive results of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd like to think that we're in a very solid place. Financially, we're in a very solid place.
Right.
Our staff seems to be doing very well, and as Paul said, we have a lot of longevity within the employees that work here, and so while the healthcare marketplace is a challenging one every day, I'd like to think that we're doing a really, really fine job of staying the course and maintaining, as you've already described, Brian, that quality of care, where that our patients are oblivious to the fact that within our walls we have all these other challenges that are presented by Medicare or by Highmark or UPMC or whatever. That's not for our patients to see. Our patients need to see that we care about them. We're giving them excellent product, excellent services, and and we're able to take care of those other issues, kind of behind our closed doors. All of those things are very important for a business to remain viable, and I think we're doing a fine job of that.
Very good. I've been talking with Ed and Paul De La Torre, the owners of De La Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For more information about De La Torre O&P, please visit our website, www.delatorreop.com, and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at De La Torre PRS. Ed and Paul, thanks for joining me on Amp Life. It's been informative and fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Amp Life, the #1 podcast for amputees, hosted by an amputee, and brought to you by De La Torre Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a review on iTunes or give us a like on Facebook. I'm the Brian Moe. I invite you to visit our website, www.amplifepodcast.com, or check us out on Facebook at Amp Life Podcast.